Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you so much for spending your time with me tonight. Before we get into it, if you had been part of the original 1922 expedition into Tutankhamun's tomb and you knew what was waiting inside, would you have still opened the door? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's get into it. I want to be precise about something before I begin. I am not a superstitious woman. I did not grow up in a household that tolerated ghost stories or old wives' warnings. My mother was a structural engineer. My father cataloged Roman era ceramics for the British Museum for 31 years. I earned my doctorate in Egyptological field studies from University College London in 2004, and I have since spent the better part of 2 decades crawling through rock, breathing limestone dust, and writing reports in the language of measurement and evidence. I say all of this not to impress you, but because I need you to understand who is telling you this. I need you to understand that what I am about to describe did not happen to a frightened person prone to fantasy. It happened to me, and I have spent the last 14 months trying to find a rational framework for it, and I cannot. What I am writing now is not a formal report. The formal report, the one submitted to the Supreme Council of Antiquities and the joint British-Egyptian conservation team I was embedded with, contains none of this. That report is clean. It is competent. It discusses sediment layering, pigment degradation, humidity readings, and the structural integrity of the western antechamber's ceiling. It does not mention what I heard on the night of the 14th of March, 2019. It does not mention what I saw pressed against the far wall of the third corridor at approximately 2:47 in the morning. It does not mention the smell, and it certainly does not mention the sound of my own name being spoken from a place that had been sealed for 3,300 years. This is the account I did not submit. This is the account I am leaving somewhere it might eventually be found, because I believe that what happened to me is connected to something that has been happening in that valley for a very long time. And I believe the people who keep opening those doors deserve to know what is waiting on the other side. I want to start with the history, because the history is the only thing I still trust completely. On the 4th of November 1922, a boy named Hussein, a water carrier employed by the British archaeologist Howard Carter, was digging in the sand outside a cluster of workers' huts in the Valley of the Kings when his digging stick struck something solid. Not rock, something shaped. Something cut with deliberate human intention into the bedrock beneath the sand. It was a step. Carved precisely, cleanly, the edges still true, after more than 3 millennia underground, Carter was summoned immediately. More steps were uncovered over the course of that afternoon and the following morning. 12 in total, each one leading deeper, each one confirming that what lay at the bottom was not a natural formation but a constructed thing, a thing that someone had made and then hidden. The steps led to a door, and on that door, in clay that had hardened like stone, was a seal that had not been broken in over 3,000 years. Carter famously made a small hole in the upper left corner of that door, held a candle up to it, and peered through the gap into the dark beyond. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, standing directly behind him in the narrow cutting, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter said the words that have been repeated in every account of that day ever since. Yes, wonderful things. He saw wonderful things: gilded furniture, animal-headed couches, alabaster vessels catching the candlelight. The accumulated treasure of a boy king who had died at 19 years old and been placed in the earth with everything he might need in the next world. It was, by any measure, the greatest archaeological discovery in modern history. 1922 was the year the ancient world opened its eyes and looked back at us. What Carter did not say, and what does not appear in any of his official dispatches or public statements from that period, is that the team's canary, a yellow canary Carter had brought with him from England, which the Egyptian workers on the dig had taken to calling the good luck bird, died that same day, the 4th of November, the day the steps were found. It was discovered in its cage in Carter's field office at Luxor, and the manner of its death was not peaceful. A cobra had entered the office through a gap in the window frame, coiled itself around the cage, and crushed the bird through the bars. The snake was still there when the assistant who found it opened the door. It had not left. The workers who saw it refused to continue for 2 full days. They said the cobra was the guardian of the pharaoh. They said it wore the uraeus, the royal serpent, that ancient symbol of divine protection and righteous destruction. They said it had come to take the first soul back. Carter dismissed this. He was a rational and methodical man. He had spent his entire career learning to dismiss things that could not be measured. He spent the next 10 years cataloging the contents of Tutankhamun's tomb 5,398 individual objects. He was nothing if not thorough. He wept, reportedly, when he first saw the gold mask up close. He wrote in his journal that the face of the boy king was serene, that it bore an expression of absolute quiet authority that made the entire chamber feel like an antechamber to something vaster than archaeology could reach. He wrote that he had never, in 30 years of field work, felt so strongly that he was a guest in a space that was not designed to receive him. He then returned to London, where he spent the rest of his life struggling with anxiety, with insomnia that worsened each year, and with what his own sister described in her private correspondence as a creeping dread that had settled into him after 1922 and never fully lifted. Howard Carter died in 1939 at the age of 64. In the last photograph taken of him, his eyes are very still. Lord Carnarvon, his patron, and the man who had funded the entire excavation, died on the 5th of April, 1923. Less than 5 months after the tomb was opened, the cause, on record, was blood poisoning. It began with a mosquito bite on his left cheek that he opened further while shaving. The infection spread rapidly. He was taken to the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, where the best medical care available to a man of his wealth and station could not arrest whatever was moving through him. He died at 2 a.m. And here is the detail that does not appear in most careful retellings of this story. At the precise moment of his death, every electric light in Cairo reportedly went out, a complete failure of the city's power supply. The authorities gave the explanation that has always served the authorities in such moments: a coincidence, a technical failure, timing that meant nothing. Meanwhile, at Carnarvon's estate at Highclere Castle in Hampshire, his fox terrier began howling at the same hour, 2 a.m. English time. The dog was found dead by the following morning, with no physical cause that the estate's veterinarian could identify. Carnarvon's son, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, was later asked by a journalist whether he believed in the curse. He said he neither believed nor disbelieved. He said that after his father's death, the family never spoke of the tomb. He said there was something about the whole matter that felt like a door that should have stayed closed. He said this in 1977. By that year, over 20 people with direct or close connections to the tomb's opening had died under circumstances that he described in his own words as difficult to explain comfortably. The list does not compress well into comfortable summary, so I will give it to you plainly. Arthur Mace, one of Carter's chief assistants, who had physically helped clear the antechamber of its objects, died in Cairo in 1928 of a wasting illness that exhausted every available diagnosis. He had complained, in the months before his death, of a persistent sense of being watched. George J. Gould, an American financier and railroad magnate who visited the tomb in the months following its opening, developed a severe fever within hours of leaving the site and was dead the following morning. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who had x-rayed the mummy of Tutankhamun in order to determine his age and physical condition, died unexpectedly in 1923. Within weeks of performing the procedure, he had been in good health. The Egyptian prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, who attended the opening celebrations, was shot and killed by his wife in a London hotel 3 months later. Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother, who had also been present at the tomb, died in September of 1923 at the age of 43, following a dental surgery that triggered septicemia in a man who had given no indication of being in poor general health. Arthur Weigall, a journalist who had stood at the tomb's entrance and reportedly said of Carter's theatrical excitement at the opening ceremony, given the way he is behaving, "I give him 6 weeks to live," died himself of an unidentified illness in 1934. He was 56. The sensible people, the methodologically careful historians, and the epidemiologists who have since studied this cluster of deaths will tell you these are coincidences. They will produce statistical models. They will note that many people entered the tomb and lived long, healthy, unremarkable lives thereafter. Carter himself, the photographer Harry Burton, the linguist Alan Gardiner. The deaths, they say, are consistent with the expected mortality rate of a large group of aging men operating in the early 20th century, before modern medicine had fully developed. In conditions of significant physical stress and exposure to desert climates, this is the rational account. I have delivered this account myself, in lectures, at conferences, in introductory seminars for first-year students who came in wanting to hear about the curse and needed, I believed, to hear about evidence instead. I believed the rational account. I believed it completely until the 14th of March, 2019, at 2:47 in the morning, in the third corridor of a tomb that is not Tutankhamun's. The site where I was working is in the eastern branch of the Valley of the Kings, in a sector that received almost no serious excavation attention throughout the 20th century, because the ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s suggested nothing of significance lay beneath the surface. The surveys were not wrong in the sense of malfunction. They were wrong in a stranger sense. Something was down there that the equipment could not read with any consistency. The readings were described in the original survey report, filed in 1987 by a British-Egyptian joint team, as acoustically anomalous. The surveying geologist's handwritten note in the margin of his own copy of the report, a copy I was shown by a colleague who found it in the survey archive at Luxor, read simply, "Like trying to measure a room that keeps changing size." That site was re-examined in 2015 using more sophisticated, ground-penetrating technology, and the anomaly was confirmed as a tomb complex. Excavation began in 2016 under the leadership of a senior epigrapher I will refer to in this account only as Dr. R., a woman in her 60s with 3 decades of experience working tomb texts in the Valley of the Kings, a person of extraordinary methodological patience and absolutely no taste for drama. She had been working this specific site for 3 seasons. I arrived in Luxor on the 1st of March, 2019, brought in as a conservation specialist. My specific role was to assess the pigment condition of the hieroglyphic wall texts that had been uncovered in the first 2 corridors of the tomb during the previous autumn season, and to recommend humidity control protocols to slow any further pigment degradation before the team had the opportunity to fully document the texts. It was technical work, precise work. I was expected to be on site for 6 weeks. I arrived in the afternoon and was taken directly to the dig house, a low concrete building 800 meters from the excavation site, with a generator that ran continuously through the night and a wide open terrace facing the valley where the team sat in the evenings with tea, talking through the day's findings in the specific, exhausted shorthand of people who have been thinking the same thoughts for hours and still cannot stop. I liked the team immediately. These things matter in fieldwork, the quality of the people you are enclosed with, because in an active excavation, you are, in a real sense, enclosed. The valley holds you. The desert holds you. The dig house becomes the whole world between the morning whistle and the evening meal. I was taken to the site the following morning. The entry shaft was cut into the valley floor, a rectangle of cleared limestone, approximately 1 meter by 1.5 meters, with a metal ladder descending 8 meters into the first corridor. I went down in the standard field PPE, nitrile gloves, Tyvek coverall suit, 95 respirator, hard hat with mounted headlamp. I carried my fiber optic lighting wand, my calibrated humidity sensor, my documentation camera, and a field notebook in the breast pocket of my coverall. In my kit bag on my back, a 4-inch Marshalltown trowel, a roll of camel hair brushes in graduated sizes, a Munsell soil color chart for pigment matching, and a set of linen documentation wraps for anything requiring temporary padding. The kit is the same kit I have carried into every tomb I have ever worked. It is heavy and familiar, and it has always felt like enough. I had done this descended into a sealed ancient space dozens of times. I have never lost my feeling for it. The moment you straighten up inside a first corridor and sweep your headlamp across walls of undisturbed ancient paint is the moment I became an Egyptologist, and the moment I keep becoming one, each time it happens. It is not reverence exactly. It is more specific than that. It is the physical experience of being the living boundary between then and now, the hinge point, the place where the ancient world is still present and the modern world has just barely arrived. The first corridor was in extraordinary condition. The plaster substrate was stable, the humidity readings consistent with a well-sealed environment that had experienced minimal air infiltration since its last opening, which the team's geologist had dated, from chemical signatures in the sediment layer at the entry shaft to the period of the 21st dynasty. The wall texts were legible, the ochre and lapis pigment vivid in the cold fiber optic light. I set up my humidity monitors at 2-meter intervals along both walls, anchored my documentation rig, and began working. I was happy. I want to say that plainly, because what came later makes it easy to forget that there were several days of very clean, very satisfying work in which nothing was wrong. The second corridor presented the first anomaly, and it was a structural one rather than a supernatural one. Not yet. The ceiling of the second corridor showed evidence of repair work that was inconsistent with the tomb's original construction period. The repair mortar, a different compound from the original, lighter in color and finer in grain, had been dated by the site geologist to the 21st dynasty, roughly 3 centuries after the tomb's initial construction. Someone had re-entered this tomb. Not to rob it, there was no evidence of disturbance in the first corridor's object arrangement, which, though largely dispersed by centuries of gradual sand infiltration, showed no signs of the chaotic disruption that characterizes ancient tomb robbery. Someone had come back specifically to repair the second corridor's ceiling, and then resealed the tomb from inside, and then sealed it again at the entry. Dr. R's hypothesis, which she shared with the team over dinner on the 4th of March, was that this was a priestly restoration, a practice documented from the 21st dynasty period, when the priests of Amun systematically re-entered compromised royal tombs to repack displaced mummies and restore damaged protections. What was unusual, she noted, was the location. A ceiling repair in the second corridor, rather than at the outer door, suggested that whatever the priests were protecting was not the objects in the outer chamber, but something further inside. Something in the third corridor, which at that point the team had not yet accessed. The limestone seal panel that closed the entrance to the third corridor was still intact, still mortared at its edges, untouched. I remember looking at it that evening, in the fiber optic light, the pale stone of it, the precision of the mortared joint. The way the hieroglyphic text on its surface continued without interruption from the wall text on either side of it, meaning it had been carved and painted as part of a continuous surface. The warning written across the seal itself so that whoever came to the seal would read the warning on the seal before they ever opened it. It was opened on the 11th of March. The stonemason worked at the mortar for most of the morning, and the limestone panel was lifted away in the early afternoon, with fiber padding protecting the surrounding wall surface, slowly, with the care these things require. The air that came out of the corridor beyond was different in a way that I noted in my field records that evening and then crossed out, because I did not have precise clinical language for it, and field records require precise clinical language. What I wrote first was air quality distinct from outer corridors, colder in character, if not in temperature. There was also a smell. I wrote it as faint organic compound, possibly natron residue or deteriorated resin. I crossed all of it out and wrote temperature differential less than 2 degrees Celsius. Humidity reading stable, which was true, which was also insufficient, because the smell was not natron and it was not resin. It was something I had no reference for, not decay, not damp, not the mineral dryness of compacted limestone dust. It was the smell of air that had been breathed before. Not recently, but breathed. Used. The smell of a space that had been occupied by something that was still occupying it. I have no better language for it than that, and I am an Egyptologist with 20 years of tombs in my lungs, and I know what old enclosed air smells like, and it does not smell like that. Dr. R went in first. Then the stonemason. Then a young epigrapher from Cairo University I will call Tariq, who had been working the outer corridor texts with meticulous care for the past 2 seasons. Then me. The corridor was narrower than the outer two. The ceiling was lower. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in hieroglyphic text that was denser than anything in the outer corridors, packed with signs, the columns tight and close, the arrangement unlike any standard funerary text suite I had worked with in 20 years of field study, not the Book of the Dead. Not the Amduat, which describes the journey of the sun through the 12 hours of night. Not the Litany of Ra, something I had not encountered before in this configuration. Something that made Tariq, who reads Middle Egyptian fluently and with the ease of someone for whom it is a professional reflex, go very quiet. I watched him work his way down the length of the left wall, tracing the columns of text with his flashlight without touching the surface, his lips moving slightly in the way they moved when he was translating under his breath. He covered approximately 6 meters of text in about 20 minutes, and then he stopped, and he stood still for a moment, and then he turned to Dr. R and spoke to her in Arabic. She listened. Her expression did not change, which was itself a kind of expression if you knew her. She turned to me and said, "He is saying that the texts are warnings, that the walls are covered entirely in warnings." I asked, "Warnings against what?" She relayed the question. Tariq spoke again, not looking away from the wall. She translated. He says the texts describe a guardian, not a deity in the conventional sense, not the 4 sons of Horus, not Anubis in his standard protective function. Something the text names with a compound term that does not translate cleanly into English. The closest Tariq can find is something like a mouth that has not forgotten. He says the texts warn that this guardian does not depart from the body it was set to protect, that it exists within the physical boundary of the limestone within it, as in confined to it, as in the limestone is not merely a material but a kind of lock, and the thing sealed inside the lock speaks, he says. It learns the names of those who disturb it from the air they leave behind, from the breath they exhale inside the corridor, and it calls them by those names. And if you answer, the texts say, you give it something it keeps, something it adds to itself. I asked what it adds to itself. Tariq turned his head slightly, not quite looking at me. He said he would rather not read that section again today. I said of course, and I meant it, and we continued working. We spent 2 hours in the 3rd corridor that first day. I took all my readings. I documented the wall text in sections, photographing each column with the calibrated documentation camera, making annotations in my notebook. The humidity was stable. The pigment was in extraordinary condition, better than the outer corridors, which was consistent with the tighter seal. Nothing in my instruments indicated anything unusual. But when we climbed back up through the entry shaft, and I sat down on a flat rock in the open air of the valley, I noticed that my hands were shaking. Not with cold. My core temperature was entirely normal. My hands were shaking with something that did not have a good clinical name. I wrote it in my personal notes that evening as sustained, low-level neurological agitation, possible stress response to enclosed environment. Then I ate dinner and read for an hour and went to sleep. I woke at 2 a.m, completely, instantly. The way you wake when a sound has pulled you out of sleep, except there had been no sound that I could identify. The room was exactly as I had left it. The generator was running its steady, low hum outside. The window was shut against the night cold of the desert in March. My field kit was stacked against the wall by the door. There was nothing wrong in any accessible sense. I lay in the dark for 20 minutes, breathing evenly, and then I fell back to sleep. I wrote it off as travel disruption, the body's clock still adjusting. The next 2 days were unremarkable. Good days. We made real progress on the documentation. Tariq worked through the wall text with methodical focus, filling his small green field notebook with transcriptions. He did not volunteer further information about the content of the warnings, and I respected that. There was a quality to his work in the third corridor that I recognized as protective the focus of a person who has decided that the material requires a certain kind of managed distance. On the evening of the 13th, I brought him tea on the terrace after dinner and asked him directly. Tariq speaks English fluently. I had heard him slip between Arabic and English several times during ordinary sight conversation, and he had explained early in the season that he defaulted to Arabic in professional settings simply because the precision of his technical vocabulary was sharper in his first language. On the terrace, over tea, in the dark, he spoke to me in English without any difficulty. I said, "Tariq, I need to understand what those walls actually say, not the summary, the detail." He was quiet for a long time. He held his tea with both hands and looked out toward the valley, which was invisible in the dark, but present the way something very large is always present, whether you can see it or not. Then he spoke slowly, choosing his words the way someone chooses their footing on uncertain ground. He said the individual interred at the far end of the corridor had agreed to something before his death. An agreement with the priests, not a conventional funerary contract, not the standard arrangement of prayers and offerings in exchange for divine passage. Something more specific. Something the text describes as a division, a voluntary partition of what we would call the self. The part that travels to the field of reeds, to the conventional afterlife, that part was sent on normally, with the standard funerary rites. But there is another part, the part the texts call the Kha, though Tariq was careful to say this was not quite the standard Kha as Egyptologists usually understand it, more like a specific layer of it. The part that holds the accumulated memory of all the people the dying man had ever known, every name he had ever learned, every face, every voice. That part was not sent on. That part was sealed with the body. Locked inside the limestone boundary by a ritual the texts describe in procedural detail that Tariq said he had never encountered in any other funerary context. Locked not as a punishment, but as a function. Locked as a mechanism. The thing inside the limestone was not imprisoned. It was deployed. It was left there deliberately, by agreement, to serve as what the texts call the remembering mouth, the guardian that recognizes, the presence that learns who you are from the air you breathe into the space and then speaks your name back to you and waits to see if you will answer. I asked what happened if you answered. Tariq looked at his tea for a long time. Then he said the texts describe a kind of absorption, not violent, not dramatic, the way a flame absorbs oxygen, the way a dry thing absorbs water. The thing in the limestone had been built from one person's accumulated knowledge of other people, and when someone entered the space and responded to it, confirmed themselves, gave it a point of contact, it expanded, added to itself, took what it could reach of you, and incorporated it. And the person who answered was thereafter, the texts suggest, incomplete in some way that was not visible but was present. The way a room feels different after something has been removed from it, even when you cannot immediately identify what is gone, Tariq set down his tea. He said he thought we should keep careful records of who entered the corridor and when. I agreed. We said goodnight. I went to my room. I set my alarm for 6:30. I lay in the dark for perhaps 15 minutes, and then I was asleep. At 2:43 in the morning, I was awake with the same complete suddenness as 3 nights before. Except this time, it was not nothing that had woken me. This time there was a sound, my name, coming through the closed window from the direction of the valley, from the direction of the site. My name in a layered quality I had never heard before and have not had adequate language for since my name in what I can only approximate as a chord. Several registers at once, one of them my own voice. Not a recording of my voice, not an impression of it. My voice as I know it from the inside, the precise timbre and register of the way I speak when I am explaining something I know well, and underneath it and alongside it, other registers, older, rougher, voices that had learned my name the way you learn a word in a language that is not your native one correctly, without error, but carrying with them the faint trace of a different mouth. I sat up. I turned on my lamp. The room was empty. The window showed only desert dark and stars. I sat on the edge of my bed and ran through every rational explanation available to me, and there were several, and none of them were satisfying. And I put on my trousers and my boots and my jacket, and I went to the site. I cannot fully explain this decision, except to say that it did not feel like a decision made from fear. It felt like a decision made from the specific professional compulsion of someone who needs to verify with their own instruments whether something has changed in a space they are responsible for monitoring. I took my headlamp, my fiber optic wand, and my humidity sensor. I walked the 800 meters to the entry shaft in the dark desert, the valley completely silent around me, the limestone pale in starlight. I went down the ladder. I moved through the first corridor. I passed through the second. I ducked through the limestone gap into the third. The humidity readings were identical to my previous documentation. The walls were exactly as I had left them. The pigment was stable. I moved my fiber optic wand along the left wall, then the right, checking each section. Everything was in order. I was at approximately the midpoint of the corridor, roughly 5.5 meters from the back wall, when I became aware that there was something at the far end. Let me be precise, because precision is all I have left to offer. The back wall of the third corridor was the limit of our current access. We believed there was a sealed chamber beyond it, but we had not yet confirmed this. It was approximately 5.5 meters from where I was standing. In the space between my headlamp beam and the back wall, at a point that my headlamp light reached but did not fully illuminate, there was a shape, the height of a person. Not distinct at its edges, the way a solid object would be distinct, not a person standing in my corridor, more like the shadow of a person, the impression of a form, the density of the dark organized in the shape of something that had decided to be visible. What I can tell you about its proportions is this. The head sat too high. Not by much, perhaps 4 or 5 centimeters above where a head of that silhouette should have been, relative to the width of the shoulders. It was the specific wrongness of a figure whose spine is longer than the body around it can account for, and the angle of the shoulders they were not level. One sat fractionally higher than the other, in a way that did not read as a casual human lean. It read as something that had assembled the posture of standing from memory rather than from practice. Something that knew what standing looked like, but had not done it in a very long time. It was not moving. It was simply there, and it was oriented toward me. I understood this not from any visual cue. I can clearly identify the shape had no discernible features, no face, no limbs I could individually distinguish. I understood it the way you understand that someone in a room behind you has turned to look at you, a shift in the quality of the attention in the space, a change in what the dark is doing, and then my name from the shape from the far end of the corridor, in exactly the same layered quality I had heard through the window, except now with a third register underneath the two I had heard before, something that was not a voice at all, something that was only the absence of silence, the sound of a held breath extended across 3,000 years, finally finding something it recognized enough to spend itself on. I did not answer. I want to be as clear as I can be about this, because I believe it is the most important thing I can tell you. I did not answer. Not because I was rational enough in that moment to override my instincts. I was not particularly rational in that moment. But because in the exact second that the layered sound of my name reached me in that corridor, I understood with a certainty that bypass language, that answering was the specific thing I must not do. That the shape was waiting for confirmation, that it needed me to respond in order to do what it was built to do, that my voice, returning to it from my mouth, in the corridor, inside the limestone, would give it the contact point it required. Tariq's words from the previous evening were somewhere in me, not as a decision, but as a physical fact. Do not answer. Do not confirm yourself to it. Give it nothing to absorb. I backed out of the corridor. Slowly, I kept my headlamp aimed at the midpoint of the corridor rather than directly at the shape, because looking directly at it felt like a form of engagement I was not prepared to risk. I backed through the limestone gap with my hand on the wall for guidance, and I did not look away from the interior of the third corridor until I was fully into the second. Then I turned and moved through the second corridor, and the first, and up the ladder and into the open air of the valley with the stars blazing overhead and the enormous indifferent dark of the desert around me. And I sat down on a flat rock and put my hands on my knees and breathed. Nothing came up the ladder after me. Nothing moved in the valley. I sat there for perhaps 40 minutes, long enough to be certain that the open air was just open air, and then I walked back to the dig house, went to my room, sat on my bed, and did not sleep again before the alarm. At breakfast, I said nothing. I made the decision. I have since spent a year and 2 months questioning the decision that the formal excavation record would remain clean, that what I had experienced would not appear in any document attached to the site's official project number. I told myself it was professionalism. That field reports are not the place for the subjective experience of late-night corridor visits undertaken outside normal working hours by a specialist who had apparently frightened herself in a small dark space. And there was truth in that. But there was also something else underneath it, a very specific and very human fear. Not fear of the thing in the corridor. Fear of becoming the kind of Egyptologist whose work is thereafter viewed through a particular lens. Fear of the conversations that happen carefully in the passive tense. She seems to have had some difficulty with the isolation. The field work affected her somewhat. I did not want to be that woman. So I kept my mouth shut, and I documented the corridor's wall texts, and the pigment conditions, and the humidity readings, and I wrote my professional report, and I left. But what I found afterward when I returned to London and spent the better part of the following autumn reading the primary source material on the deaths connected to the 1922 tomb opening is what I cannot reconcile with the decision to stay silent, and what has led me to write this account now. The pattern in those deaths is not the pattern the tabloids describe. It is not the dramatic, timed, curse word inscribed above the door pattern of popular mythology. The pattern is subtler and worse. It begins, in almost every case, where sufficient personal documentation survives, with something the victim described in the weeks before their death as a sense of being followed, of being called, of hearing something that was nearly a voice or nearly their own name in the peripheral range of their hearing, in moments of quiet and solitude. Carter himself describes this in an unpublished letter held at the Griffith Institute at Oxford, which I visited in October of 2019. He describes a resonance in his left ear, a humming that had no physical source, that he heard most acutely when he was alone and in a quiet room. He describes it not as a voice, but as the shape of a voice. The impression, he writes, that something is attempting language and has not quite assembled the instrument for it. Carter did not answer it, or if he did not record it. He died in 1939, at 64 years old, in his home in London, of lymphoma. Not a young man's death, not an obviously cursed death. But the letter exists, and it ends with a sentence I have returned to more times than I can count. Carter writes, I no longer go into the tomb. I have not gone in since last November. I do not believe I will go in again, not because I fear the work, because the work has found me here. Carnarvon did answer. I cannot prove this, but I believe it. Carnarvon's personal physician, a Dr. Johnstone, kept detailed case notes during the week of his final illness in Cairo in April of 1923, and those notes describe the quality of Carnarvon's delirium in terms that have stayed with me since the first time I read them. In October of 2019, I made a specific research trip to Cairo. I had no other reason to go, no field work, no conference, because I needed to read those case notes myself and not from a secondary account. The archive that holds them is in the Egyptian Medical Records Collection at the Cairo University Library, accessible to researchers with the appropriate institutional credentials. I sat in a reading room and read Dr. Johnstone's handwriting for 2 hours. What those notes describe is this: the quality of Carnarvon's delirium was not the quality of a delirious man speaking to his own fever. It had the structure of a dialogue, the pauses, the rhythms, the nodding, and the responding. In English, and also in a language Johnstone could not identify, which he described as ancient in character, the way very old music sounds different from new music without the difference being easily articulated. The physical language of a man who believed he was being answered. Carnarvon was being answered. Because Carnarvon, at some point after entering the tomb in November of 1922, had answered something first. And the thing he had answered had kept the contact and followed him to Cairo and spoken to him in his fever and taken whatever it had been trying to take from him since the day he first breathed the air of that corridor and gave his name to the dark. This is what I believe. I want to be careful about the word believe because I am a researcher and beliefs require evidence, and the evidence I have is fragmentary and circumstantial and would not survive a peer review committee. But I am also a woman who stood in a corridor in the eastern branch of the Valley of the Kings at 2:47 in the morning and heard her own name in a voice she recognized as her own and felt with absolute physical certainty that the correct response was silence. And I have since read the accounts of the people who did not choose silence, and I have noted the shape of their ends, and I am no longer able to hold both the rational account and my own experience in the same hand without one of them falling. There is something in those walls. Not in all of them. I want to be clear about that too. The Valley of the Kings holds over 60 confirmed tombs and numerous unconfirmed sites, and the vast majority of them have been entered and worked and cataloged without incident of the kind I am describing. The thing in the limestone of the site I worked is specific to that site, the product of a specific ancient ritual that the 21st dynasty priests knew well enough to repair and recontain when the ceiling cracked. But I do not think it is the only such thing. I think the valley holds more than one space sealed with more than one intent. And I think the workers who've been opening those spaces for 100 years with diamond-tipped saws and ground-penetrating radar and all the excellent equipment of modernity have been making the same error that Howard Carter's canary made before them. They have been breathing the air in, and something in the dark has been breathing back. I returned to London in late March of 2019. I completed my conservation report in April. It is filed and complete and does not contain any of this. I teach 2 seminars a term at University College London. I have not returned to fieldwork. In my department records, this is logged as a personal decision following a period of intensive field deployment, which is accurate and inadequate. Some nights I wake in the dark of my flat in Bloomsbury with the same complete and total suddenness, and I lie still, and I listen to the sounds of London performing itself around me at 3 in the morning. The traffic on the Euston Road, the groan of the buildings heating, the distant rhythm of the city that never quite sleeps. I have not heard my name from any direction I cannot account for. I keep the window closed on quiet nights, and I do not answer anything that calls me from a place I cannot see. I am leaving this document in the UCL Egyptology archive in the miscellaneous field notes collection. I have cataloged it under my project reference number for the 2019 season, with the author name withheld at my own request. I expect it will sit in the collection for some time before anyone finds it. When they do, I expect they will read it as what it might be, a psychological record of the specific pressures of isolated desert fieldwork on a researcher who had perhaps spent too many years underground. They may be right. I have genuinely considered this possibility. I have considered it the way you consider a door that you are standing in front of, knowing that what is on the other side will determine a great deal about who you are from that point forward. But if the person reading this is someone who has been in a corridor like the one I have described, if you have breathed the old air out of a space that was sealed with serious intent, if you have woken in the night with the complete certainty that something was addressing you from a direction that did not have a rational source, if you have heard your own name in the specific quality of your own voice coming from a place that is 3,000 years old, then I need you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. Do not answer. Whatever the sound knows about you, whatever register of your own voice it has learned from the breath you left behind when you walked into that corridor with your headlamp and your humidity sensor and your absolute professional confidence, do not give it the confirmation it is waiting for. The priests who built that tomb and the priests who came back 3 centuries later to remortar the ceiling understood what they had created and understood exactly what was required to contain it. The limestone is the lock. The limestone has always been the lock, but a lock is only useful if you are on the correct side of it. Get back to the limestone. Keep moving toward the open air. Do not stop. Do not answer. Some people who entered that valley did not make it back in time. I do not know, with certainty, whether the shape I saw at the end of the corridor on the 14th of March, 2019, is the same mechanism that spoke to Carnarvon in his fever in the Continental Savoy Hotel in April of 1923. I do not know if it is the same thing Carter heard humming in his left ear in the quiet rooms of his London home for the last 17 years of his life. I do not know if the deaths that followed the opening of the boy king's tomb were the result of something that was spoken to and answered, or whether they were simply deaths. I am an Egyptologist. I am not a person who knows with certainty what lives in the dark at the end of a sealed corridor. I only know what I heard, and I know what I did not say back, and I know that I am here, in London, in the light, writing this down. And I know that some of the people who went into that valley before me are not. If you found this file in the archives, subscribe to Vaulted World Secrets, and make sure the next sealed account reaches you when it surfaces. Survival rule. If you hear your own voice speaking your own name from a corridor that has been sealed for 3,000 years, do not answer it. Whatever it is building from the names it has collected, it should not have yours.